Crew, 0. My job at the ferry yard started with bulbs and ended with buttons. It had for 15 years. I was one of those maintenance men people barely see unless a light goes out or the ticket machine takes their money and coughs it back with a polite refusal. I wore a canvas jacket that never quite dried, 2 sizes bigger in case of weather, and I carried a tool bag that stained whatever it touched. My locker had a spare pair of socks, a yellow towel that smelled like the cabinet under a sink, and a tin cup that I used for coffee until the rim went weird with dents. The yard wasn't much. A row of squat buildings with their best faces toward the water, a parking lot with seagull freckles, and a pier numbered 1 through 8 like schoolroom desks. A drab office with a map on the wall that showed routes in bright aquarium colors, lines curving through blue like silk ribbons. My desk faced the window, which meant I watched the weather more than the work orders. The fog came most in the shoulder seasons, laying down across the harbor like felt. It made parts of the world disappear and then come back damp around the edges, like leaving a glass on a varnished table. Pier 6 had a stutter in its power the week before the thing with the horn. I went down after lunch with a tester in my pocket and a coil of conduit over my shoulder, figuring I'd replace a run or reseat a breaker the way you reseat a loose tooth. The signboard over the gangway clicked hard enough to feel in your fillings, then settled on its green letters. On time. Some commuters in pea coats glanced up. One of them, a woman with a scarf twisted twice, checked her phone like she didn't trust the sign, which I respected. Signs lie all kinds of small ways. The ferry at 6 had an automatic ramp that moved with this deliberate grace I never liked. It didn't admit to gears. It bent down like a knee under a church pew. I tested the kiosk, swiped my maintenance card, got a friendly beep and thought, fine. Whatever had been wrong here had cured itself while I was finding my gloves. It happens. Electrical gremlins hide when you show up with a meter. I stood there anyway, leaning my hip to the handrail and letting the fog thread my hair. The sign clicked again, its cadence a little off the clock. Under on time, another line lit that I hadn't seen before. Crew, 0. It looked like a joke, like when the snack machine advertises fresh bananas in February. I thought about calling dispatch, telling them the sign was wrong, but the horn sounded its flattest tone, the one that means move or don't, but I'm leaving. The commuters filed along the gangway with the calm of people who take orders from schedules. The validator at the head of the ramp chimed with each tap like a cash register in a soft gloved hand. I watched the footfalls go, rubber boots, square heels, sneakers you could pluck out of a pile by their neon. A man with a thermos ID, seen 100 mornings, put his cup under the machine and waited for tea. He got steam and a little spray of rust taste, which made him wince and shrug like it wasn't the day's worst thing. I stepped back while they boarded. It's not my habit to ride. The yard kept me to the piers, but when the gangway lifted all gentle again and the ferry pulled away, I saw the wheelhouse glass holding only fog. I'd never seen it empty before. I took off my hat and wiped my hairline with the inside of my elbow. Maybe the pilot ducked, maybe reflections. I told myself lots of maybes that chose a direction only because the other direction made my stomach feel loose. Back in the office, the work order system dinged for a non-critical anomaly at Pier 6, display misreporting crew count. I wrote back with a comment about rebooting the board, using a tone that was practical, like, we know what a board is and how it lies. There was a meeting at 2 where my boss, whose name was Murdo, but went by Murd, reminded us that the city had let them keep us short-staffed, only on the condition that we didn't, to create problems we couldn't staff to fix. He liked to say it like a riddle. Do not, he added, pointing with a stack of printouts, let the light go out on a pier sign. People panic at symbols. He didn't call on me. I wouldn't have told him about the wheelhouse even if he had. I try not to bring anything into a room that might make more rooms. But there was a hitch in my afternoon. a pull to go back out and look at the empty seats and the paper cups in their little holders. I stayed at my desk, told myself to keep my hands where the work was. By the next morning, the sign still had crew, 0, and nothing in the logs showed a reset. The commuter line stretched down the pier with the peculiar patience of people who had learned the schedule. Isn't tea a promise so much as a habit? Fog again, the horn again, the ramp's knee bent without anyone at the switch. The validator beeped like a polite clerk at a corner store. I stood by the railing and watched the empty wheelhouse. The coffee lids dimpled with the engine thrum the way they always did. And that made it all worse, that nothing else was wrong. I walked the pier after the ferry left, hands in my pockets because the damp finds its way in if you stand still. The pilings had that green-bearded look. A rope lay coiled on the deck, like a thing exhaled and left to cool. I stood there long enough that I had to pat my front pocket to make sure I still had my keys, which is my body's way of asking if I've lost anything bigger. On the way back to the office, I stopped by the machine and punched the button for tea. Steam came. I tasted the rust on purpose. It put this film on the tongue like old coins. I don't know why I did that. I threw the cup away and watched the drip for a minute as if it might change into a better answer. I should say something about me here, not because it matters much in the straight line of events, but because the shape of a life can make you accept a crooked thing as if it fits. My wife, Elm, left 5 years before with a suitcase and a look like a window you just washed. It was so clean you could forget the glass was there and think you might step through. We didn't have children. We had a dog named Fish who died a year after she left, and who I loved in that way you do when you slept on the floor the first night to keep his wet paws off the bed. I rented a one-bedroom above a locksmith who liked to keep his door propped open and tell anyone who'd listen about keys that opened different things than they were made for. I listened to him a lot. I like the work because it's full of things you can tighten. Wires seat or don't seat. Capacitors swell or lie flat. Burn marks tell stories in a grammar. Your hand learns to read before your eye does. It's a simple reward system, which means it's a good ride when you're done but have a family to go home to and the bar starts to feel like you re-interviewing the beers. So when the ferry kept leaving with an empty wheelhouse, I chose to think tight thoughts. Loose thoughts let air in. The cold kind you feel in your knee before a storm. I told myself automation had crept in quietly. The city liked to do things without telling the yard, because once you tell us, it becomes our job to fix your ideas. Maybe someone had promised to test remote control and hadn't told the sign about it. Maybe the 0 was a boast. Look how good we are. We need nobody. I didn't like the boast, but I could stand there under it if I squinted. On the third morning, the map at the kiosk showed the boat's little icon sliding past its terminal and out where there was only blue. The woman with the twisted scarf, she didn't wear it today. She had her hair in a bun that looked like a weather vane, squinted at the display, frowned at the blue, and looked at the water where the blue would be if the world covered its own map. Nobody said anything. The boat took a slow left. A white tendril of fog curled around the bow like steam off a soup. People looked down at their phones the way you lift a newspaper to keep your face out of trouble. The strange thing didn't arrive all at once. It arrived the way mold shows up in a shower. First a corner, then the grout turns shy. A second validator, mid-deck where no one had asked for one, stood like a lectern, neither new nor old. I could tell by the wear on the plastic, the small polish from hundreds of hands, that it hadn't appeared from a box that morning. It was as if it had been around somewhere else, like a bell brought in from a different church. I watched a man get up from his seat as if remembering some appointment, tap his card to that mid-deck validator, hear the beep, and walk to the bow gate, where the fog lay plain as a wall. He stepped through it and was gone. That phrasing kills a story in the telling because the trick is that nothing dramatic happened. He did not leap, He did not look back. No, he went as if the boat had made a stop and nobody but him knew the name. I stood there at the railing on the pier, and my mouth tasted like tea made from nails. After that, I stood at the pier more than in the office. I took to wiping down the handrail with a rag that left threads, just to look busy if Murd came by. He had a way of appearing without being seen, which is his talent and his curse. He came out once, looked at the sign like he could discipline it into truth and said, "You see this, Cal?" I said, "See what?" The best lies live close to polite ignorance. He nodded at the wheelhouse. "They're testing something. Don't make it your problem." "Does it change my job?" "Everything changes your job. Don't make it your problem," he said again, like a rule. He went back inside. The validator mid-deck flashed a small green ready light, and the one at the gangway flashed its larger one, and the horn said, "Go on, we're leaving." Folks lined up like they always did. Beep, beep. The sound was a species of comfort. I don't know why the mind takes one thing like that and builds a nest in it. Maybe you need one sound to live in if the world starts changing the pitch of all the others. The pattern unfolded itself slow. People got on. Some of them got off at the usual stop on the far side. The boat still docked there sometimes, opening its ramp to a platform with a soda machine and a canopy that dripped all day. But the rest, 1 or 2 the first day, then 3, then a handful, stood, put away their phones, and went to the lectern validator mid-deck. The beep sounded a little higher there, a touch brighter, like a smile ends with a show of teeth. The count on the side display next to it went up, 9, 10, 11. Then the count at the gangway, 2, 1, 0, went down. When the second count hit 0, the horn gave that flat tone again. Ropes moved of their own practiced will. The mid-deck gate parted just a hand's width, then a full foot, and fog rolled in with the slow insistence of a polite guest who refuses to stay on the mat. People walked forward until the fog took them. That's all. That's all there was. I looked hard for things the eye could fasten to. The deck had grit, sand, salt, a smear of something that glistened. The smell was diesel under salt under damp wool. Somebody near the front had a lunch in a paper bag, and the apple inside it tapped the bench when the engine caught a wave. All the small, ordinary things arranged themselves into an assertion. Look, see, we are real. This is a real day. That was the part I hated. After work, the bar had the same lottery numbers on the wall, and the bartender with the bad back made a face when he lifted a box of limes. He asked me how the water was, like we always did. I said it felt heavy on the eye. He said a fog, and I nodded. Words are easy when they've been said the day before. My sleep changed. I didn't notice it at first because the way sleep goes bad is it migrates. The good part slides later and later until you relate to your own day. I lay there with the window cracked to keep the apartment from smelling like the cheap varnish the landlord used every time somebody moved out. The foghorn from the breakwaters sounded on the pattern it always had, the one I had learned to put under my breathing so I wouldn't hear it. Now my breath wandered. I counted its steps back toward the horn, like you count a kid visible between parked cars. At work, I watched the mid-deck validator. I started to recognize faces, not the people in themselves, but the expressions, the small mechanical acts we repeat, adjusting a strap, double-checking a pocket, pinching a lid. I watched the woman with the weather-vane bun stand, tap the lectern, and go. Her scarf was in her bag. She did not look left or right. She looked like she remembered something she had to do. The notices started showing up on the city website in that language they teach you at the job, in case you have to be responsible without being liable. An advisory is in place for Pier 6, while routine operations continue. Anomalous traffic patterns have been observed. Temporary adjustments to crew deployment are being tested. Passengers boarding at Pier 6 may experience slight delays. Announcements that fit every possibility meant none of them meant anything. Murdo handed me a stack of printed bullet points. "If anyone asks you anything, read from this," he said. "No one asked me anything," I said. "People ask the man with the tie. Do we have a man with a tie?" He squinted. "I'm wearing a tie." He was. It had a stain on it in the shape of a continent I didn't know. He added, "Do not characterize operations." I went out to the pier because a light went out near the bench where people set their coffee while they poured for their cards. I like the small repairs. They give your hand something to think about so your mind rests. The bulb had worked loose from its socket, maybe from the thrum. I took it in my palm like a warm egg, reseated it, and the light came on with a crackle that fizzled into a steady glow. The glass warmed my fingers just enough to remind me of how bodies hold heat. I stood with my hand against the pole to feel the buzz through the metal, that little voice from the ballast that says everything's working and always will. The weather-vane woman hadn't been on the boat that morning. She didn't show the next morning either. The other faces filled out with new expressions, men who stood and frowned at their phones and sat back down, a girl who chewed her straw, a boy in a knit cap with a little metal badge on it that caught the light and made a small dot move across the aisle, as if there were a sun inside the ferry. Tiny changes opened like nails backing out of a board under slow weather. I had less appetite. Half a sandwich at noon, the bread dried at the crust where the office air had gotten to it. My hands shook at odd times. I started seeing my own face reflected in the glass of the pier office, a man with tired skin and eyebrows his father would recognize. I kept expecting the ferry to correct itself and stop at the usual terminal and discharge all its people and not open that mid-deck gate anymore. It didn't. I brought my maintenance card home one night and tapped it against different things just to hear the beep in a room that belonged to me. The sound didn't travel well. In the kitchen, the tile took the shape of it and made it tinny. In the hallway, the sound went soft, and I heard my neighbors through the thin wall, their TV, a low argument about money, the click of a nail clipper. I tapped the rim of the tin cup and got a different tone. I kept the card in my hand for a while after that, which felt foolish even while I did it. There's a thing that happens when the world's edges go fuzzy. You carry a specific item as if it were a password back into the part with lines and instructions. People hold photos for that reason. I had plastic. By the fourth day, the mid-deck validator had a small crowd before the ferry left the pier. This was new. Before they rose one by one as if privately informed. Now they queued. It was a thin line. Quiet, nobody pushing. They tapped. Beep. The numbers rolled. One woman looked at the display as if it were a scoreboard. Her mouth moved. Maybe she was counting. I tried to catch her eye because I had this sudden belief that if our eyes met, I'd be doing something useful. She didn't look up. I radioed dispatch that afternoon and said, "We might have a crowding issue. People are using a mid-deck egress when the boat isn't docked. I don't have a form for that." "Copy," said the voice, which belonged to a man who shared his lunches with gulls and resented them for taking. "Is anyone falling overboard?" "No," I said. "They're walking into fog." Long pause. I imagined him with the form book in his hand, flipping. "Is anyone injured?" "I don't know. I don't see them after." "Then it's not an injury report. Use crowd control warning." "Should I call the harbor master?" "Do not," he said, the words as clean as a new washer. "Do not escalate. When you call for help and are told not to, you learn the size of your world again." Mine shrank to the pier and my cup and the keys in my pocket. I checked the tea machine filter for rust because that was a thing I could fix. It was in fact rusty. I took it apart and held the pieces in my hand and set them on a blue towel I use for oil. The thin tin of the housing cut me. A slice so clean I didn't feel it until I'd put the thing back together and saw the red smear on the bend of my finger. I held the finger in my mouth and got the taste of iron, which echoed the taste of the tea. Coincidence is a song if you sit still long enough. On the weekend, when the office was slow, I took the ferry. I told myself it would help me understand the kind of repair I might be asked to do. Those were the words I used for myself. I also wanted to be on the deck and smell the diesel with the fog and feel the ropes move under my shoes. The horn gave that flat tone, like an argument you're too tired to have. I tapped on at the gangway. Beep. The boat was warm in patches. The benches had absorbed body heat from all the mornings. It was like the heat of a cat that leaves when you shift, and you could swear a cat had been there, but there's nothing but the dent. The speaker near my head said, mind the gap, the way it always had. A stutter I could never trace back to a breaker or a file. I sat and watched the wheelhouse and let my breath fall into the engine's rhythm. People flipped their tickets back into their wallets with that practiced little twist. A child's coat zipper rasped up to the chin. Somewhere, a cup lid popped as it found its seat. We pulled away. The city turned into silhouettes, a sixth-grade art project, cutouts against the fog. The map in the bulkhead display showed our icon going beyond the usual terminal again. An old man with eyebrows that looked like pipe cleaners pointed at the screen and then let his hand drop. There was some shuffling, like people changing their minds about which bag should be where. The mid-deck validator chimed. Beep. A man in a suit whose pants looked like they were allergic to rain stood and walked to it and tapped. Then a woman in a long sweater. Then a teenager who, deep in holding his phone 2 inches from his face, and whose eyes had that watery look, like he'd been reading in the dark and in the car and on the stairs. I stayed seated and felt ridiculous. I told myself I would stand if the boat docked at the proper terminal, or if I could see a human hand on a lever. I would not stand for fog. The line by the lectern grew to 8, then 9. The side display counted them. 9. The gangway count went down to 0. The horn sounded. The mid-deck gate sighed apart. The fog looked tangible, like fabric caught on a nail. The man in the suit went forward with the same expression he might have had stepping into a conference room where a chart waited. He went and was gone. I looked out at the water. There was water. The ferry did not stop anywhere else after that. We looped back, and the ramp at the pier bent down, and the same man came to the tea machine and this time took coffee. His hand shook when he put in the little powdered creamer. The packet made a soft puff, and some of the powder hung in the air like dust in a shaft of light. He made a face like people make at medicine. Another man, a new one to me, said, "Long day?" "Feels long," he said, and looked at the gangway like he wanted to change the subject. I went home, took off my boots by the door, and sat on the floor, my back against the wall. I don't know how long I sat that way. The floor creaked under the building's small adjustments. The radiator clicked once, then again, as the steam found a new path. I felt the cut on my finger wake up and ask to be remembered. I put a band-aid on it and watched the square go darker as it met the blood, which told me the cut was still asking to be looked at. I lay down beside my own boots and thought about the beeps and the horn and the green 0 on the display, like the number could watch me back. The city posted an advisory on Monday. In response to weather-related visibility issues, certain routes may be altered. Please follow crew instructions. There were no crew instructions because there was no crew. Someone taped the printed advisory to the glass at the pier office with blue tape that left a sticky corner where it folded on itself, and someone peeled it back. That corner collected dust. I watched it get fuzzier and made a small mental note to change the tape. I never did. There's a limit to the kinds of order a person can maintain when everything else keeps turning into fog. The social part got strange too. The bar was in that phase where the same people see each other enough that we pretend we re-strangers. A man with a mustache that leaked into his beard asked me once what I did, and I lied and said I worked nights stocking shelves. I couldn't stand to say maintenance because then he might ask me about the ferry, and I didn't want to speak it aloud to anyone who wasn't paid to nod. At work, the day grew thinner. Murd started taking calls in his office with the door closed. He pressed the receiver to his ear with his shoulder and took notes with a pencil that wore down to the metal collar. He sharpened it with a pocket knife because the electric sharpener had eaten too many pencils and I'd unplugged it for its crimes. He stopped using the walkie to call me and sent me emails instead, which suited me fine. People's voices have a way of catching on your heart. I stopped checking mine. My appetite went wrong in a steady way. I ate the same sandwich, but I couldn't taste it. Mayo felt like a trick you play on bread. The coffee tasted like the cup it was poured into. The only clean thing was water from the tap, cold, metallic, as honest as a pipe. I drank a lot of it and peed often, which put me in the office bathroom more than I liked. The light above the mirror vibrated a tiny amount, the frequency that makes your jaw want to click. I replaced it and replaced it again, and it still hummed. I stopped looking in the mirror. I washed my hands longer than the poster told me to. The paper towels were always the same kind, brown, rough, the edges feathered with cuts. I liked the scrape of them. On Wednesday night, a siren sounded somewhere far back on shore. It wasn't close enough to be an emergency, just a reminder that the police had cars and people and a job. A little boy on the ferry said, "Ooh," very quietly. His mother said, "Shh," and then, in a softer voice, "Just fog." I watched the boy look at the mid-deck gate. He licked his lip like it had a flavor on it he might recognize if he tried hard enough. He stayed by his mother. I was relieved in a small way that felt shameful, like I'd passed a test I wasn't taking. I started keeping a notebook. I wrote things like counts, the number before the horn, the number after, the faces I recognized, how many cups of tea poured rusty, whether the horn toned the same number of seconds before gate, the particular words the speaker dropped. By Friday, my numbers had more zeros than anything else. I started to see zeros in places I shouldn't. On the microwave clock in the break room, the glare on a dashboard, the circular hole in the trash lids. You can say it's suggestion, that my brain had decided on a shape and found it everywhere. You can say the shape found me. A man named Glenn, who did the night cleaning and whose shoulders had collapsed inward like the life had tried to sit on them for too long, came to the pier early one morning with a plastic bag that had sandwiches. He handed me one without asking whether I wanted it. "Turkey," he said. "They leave them out in the conference room on Fridays. No one eats the ones in plastic. They all go for the ones on plates." "Thanks," I said. "You been out there?" he asked, nodding toward the water. "Out where?" He shrugged. "Out where it goes." I went on. "I haven't gone out." He nodded like that was interesting and then not interesting. He took out his own sandwich and peeled the plastic. The smell of old refrigerator came off it faintly, that blue smell of cold air driven around by a fan. He ate half with his head turned to the side like he didn't want to show me his chewing. "You see any crew?" "No," I said. "That's funny," he said, and said nothing else for a while. "How long you been here?" I asked. "Longer than you," he said. "You lost your wife a few years back." I blinked. "How do you know that?" He pointed with his chin toward the office window where a photo used to be. Elm on a hike, not smiling. Her mouth open a bit like she was going to speak. I had removed it after she left because it's odd to have a picture of a person's life in a place where your work lives. The ghost of the square was still on the wall. "I can count squares," he said, "and I hear things." "You hear anything about what's happening?" He swallowed. "I ain't a gossip," he said, "which is what you say when you know a thing and aren't going to say it. I hear the horn in my sleep, though. I stand at my sink and put my hands in the water, and when I turn it off, I still hear it. The way you hear ring when a TV shuts off, you know." "I know." He finished his sandwich, balled up the plastic, and put it in his pocket to throw away later, because he is courteous in small ways. "Be careful," he said. "Fog covers all kinds of edges. I don't think anyone else would have said anything to me if not for Glenn. He had a way of making a sentence feel like a handkerchief, something someone had used and folded and was offering you because they wanted you not to drip on yourself. After he left, I felt guilty for thinking about going to the middeck at all, because if I went, who would watch the numbers? The idea that my watching mattered to anything should have offended me on principle. I held on to it anyway. Posts and ropes and numbers. I needed two of those to be real. Posts were real. Ropes were real. I made numbers real by writing them. The next week, someone in an office built a sign that said, "Temporary access point," and zip-tied it above the middeck gate. It was printed on a thick plastic that had a matte finish and a little bubble where the ink had pooled. I pulled at the zip tie with my nail. It held. The sign did not say where the access point led. It had an arrow that pointed nowhere useful. The sign was smaller than the decision it announced. That, more than anything, made me angry. I took a photo of it and thought I would send it to someone and ask for a better sign. I never sent it. My phone would show me the picture when I swiped up by accident. "Temporary," it said in a font that tried too hard to sound calm. News is a spill that finds its level. People started talking without saying anything. "My cousin," said a woman on the pier to somebody behind her, "knows someone who went middeck and came back with a voice that wasn't quite his." The man behind her said, The woman said, "I don't know," as if she'd caught her own sentence and wanted to shake the rumor out of it. Another time, I heard a man in an orange safety vest say to another man in the same vest, "They got a line on it now. It's not random where it opens." And then the other man said, "Who is they?" And the first man said, "You know." And the second laughed like he didn't but didn't he want to be left out of knowing. Murdo put new bullet points on my desk. "If approached by media, do not speculate." No media approached me. A reporter called Murd S-line once, when I was in his office fixing the overhead light that had started to hum so loud he turned his radio up to drown it. I heard his half, "We're operating safely. Crew counts are an internal metric. Thank you for your interest." He hung up and rubbed his eye with his knuckle until the skin went red. "I need this light quiet," he said. "Do your magic." "There's no magic," I said. "There's ballast and there's frequency." "Make it stop then," he said. And I did, because at least that and the bulb at the pier and the rust in the filter were all the same kind of problem. At the end, Murd looked at me like he wanted to ask if I believed in anything. It's a look I've seen on men when they buy lottery tickets and say the numbers out loud. Another week, the fog didn't lift so much as change its personality. It got brighter. I could see the opposite pier some mornings, the shape of it. The fog sat between piers like a wall somebody built at night. The sign still said crew, 0. Someone had tried to scratch the 0 into an 8. The sign had a protective coating. You can gouge it and only make an uglier 0. The validator's beep had developed a hiccup in the afternoons, 2 quick notes instead of 1. I rode at noon to hear it. It felt like a thing within my job, a sound outside the plan. On middeck, the queue had a rhythm I could count. 1, 2, a pause, 1, 2, 3, a pause. If you tapped your foot to it, you could feel foolish and safe at the same time. I tried not to, and discovered that not tapping can be harder than tapping. A man came in one morning wearing a city badge on a lanyard. He had a clipboard that made him official. He looked at the middeck gate and nodded once and made a mark. That was his whole job, it seemed. He didn't stop anyone or wave them on. He didn't move his mouth to their mouths or his hands to their hands. He marked. He went to the wheelhouse and stood where the pilot would stand and looked at his own reflection in the glass, which I have done. He wrote something down and left. I wanted to ask him whether he'd seen the weather-vane woman elsewhere in the city. Not because I cared for her in any way beyond her being a fact I had watched, but because if she existed somewhere else, then the ledger balanced in a way I could recognize. I didn't ask. He would have said she was not his business. One day, a man ran. He was late and tried to catch the boat. He hit the gate with his hand with the force of someone who thinks they are strong because they need to be. The gate was already coming up in that slow, careful way, but it still shut him out like an elevator after a finger. He swore under his breath and then took 3 very deep breaths like he was trying to inhale the entire situation and cough it out later. The ramp lowered again at once, which was new. The horn moaned its flat tone briefly, then stopped, like a man who clears his throat and thinks better of speaking. The man laughed, a small sound of relief because the boat had changed its mind for him. He got on and tapped. Beep. He sat. 7 minutes later, he tapped mid-deck and went. The boat had not changed its mind for him after all. It had kept its schedule. I know because I started timing the interval between tap-on and tap-off. Some people sat down, thought, read, looked out the windows, put their coffee cups to their mouths and rose at a common minute. 11 minutes and change. The change was small, but it was always there, as if someone had set a metronome and then a damp glove had brushed it each time it swung. It's a pattern you see in living things. Machines sit exactly. Blood does not. I told myself I would not get up unless I could not help it. That sounded noble. It was partly fear. I feared the fog, which is the kind of fear you can talk yourself around, and I feared the knowledge that comes after you do the thing you're afraid of, which is harder. I also feared being seen by the people on the pier who would remember my jacket and think, the maintenance man. And if he goes, what does that mean for the rest of us? Maybe no one would think that, but in the absence of other people's thoughts, your own will do. I missed 2 days of work. I lay in bed with the window open and listened to the foghorn and told myself my stomach had something. I had no fever. The world smelled like the inside of a shell, salt and old life. I dreamed, which is to say I saw pictures that belonged to me but played by someone else's rules. In one, I stood on the pier and the ropes moved like snakes. In another, I hit the gangway with my maintenance card because it wouldn't tee lower for me, and the metal gave as if I had touched skin. I woke with the kind of thirst that feels like a drug. I drank from the sink. You'd think the water would warm on the way out of the pipe, but it stayed cold, as if it had been nowhere but the metal. When I came back, Glenn left a note on my locker door. Call me if you need anything, G. Under it, he'd drawn a picture of a key that didn't fit any lock I'd ever seen. He isn't the locksmith, but he knows some of the locksmith's jokes, which are also not jokes. I folded the note and put it in my wallet. I would forget it was there until I changed wallets and wondered which part of my life had needed that key. On a Tuesday near the end of a month, the city cancelled Route 5 for equipment conflicts and temporarily rerouted its traffic to Pier 6. Murd printed a map with red arrows, and we stood together under a fluorescent light that made our skin look the same color no matter who we were. It'll be busy, he said. You sure that's smart, I said. Putting more people on. It's my job to look like things are fine, he said. It's your job to make them fine enough that my job works. I don't know if this is that kind, I said, surprising myself with the tone of it. He looked at me for a long time, like I had grown a second mouth. You feeling okay, Cal? I'll take the afternoon, I said, which is not an answer. People came. The pier boards counted them with the weight of their steps. The line bent around itself in a polite pretzel. I replaced a bulb and another went out, the way it does in old circuits when one element has been carrying the load for so long that when you relieve it, another takes the strain and gives up. I held my breath a moment when the horn sounded because it would decide something about my day for me. The ramp lowered. The validators beeped. The beep had settled into a double tone that felt to my ear like 2 fingers tapping a shoulder from different places. When the gangway count hit 0, the horn sounded and I heard someone in the line say, like a cow lowing, and someone else say, shh, as if to protect something from a word. The mid-deck line formed. I watched faces. It's rude to watch faces. I did anyway. People who lived together started moving together. A man and a woman who wore the same kind of raincoat got up in silent agreement. A girl and a boy who had the same nose but not the same eyes walked up in step and looked at the display as if to check if they were a pair. A man with a backpack stood up alone and looked at the line like it might be a bad idea to enter an empty store. He entered anyway. The queue made its sound. Beep. The display said 15. The gangway said 0. The gate opened. I could smell a new smell now under the diesel. Metal cooled and warmed quickly over and over. Heat cycling. It smells like a handrail in winter, and you can really put words to it unless you beheld a handrail in winter. My mouth filled with that water feeling again, that desire to drink. I had no cup. I swallowed air, and it did an acceptable job. The ferry turned, not in its usual long circle, but in a cut, a sharper line. The fog moved. This was the first time I'd realized the fog moved in response to the ferry rather than the other way around. I don't have words for it because we don't talk about fog as if it makes decisions. It did then. It gathered itself at the bow like a curtain in front of a door. The first man went in. He did not bob. He did not hesitate. He disappeared. The word means nothing. I mean, he was there, and then he wasn't. The second went. The third. The fourth had a hat that stayed for half a breath after the man was gone. Then the hat was gone also. The fifth looked behind him at nobody in particular and smiled with a small apology as if he were getting off at a stop someone else wanted and would leave them the seat by the window. He went. The last, 15th, paused long enough to make me think someone had whispered his name. He touched the display with his fingers like a gambler rubs a machine. He went. The display fell to 0 and the horn sounded, and the fog did a small draw-in like it had been holding its breath and had decided it was fine to breathe now. I went on the noon run and did not stand at 11 minutes. I watched my own hands. They lay where I asked them to. They did not rise. The fog slapped gently at the windows, and each slap left a print that slid down like a wet palm. The wheelhouse held a man, just for a second, a reflection of one, maybe mine, although I don't wear a cap, and then none again. I timed the beeps with my watch. I timed my heart by accident and then tried not to. The bench had a small tattoo scratched into it by a key, an arrow with a tail. I put my thumb on it and rubbed. The oil of my skin made the scratch shine. When the boat emptied to 0 on the middeck and came back to the pier, I stood to get off. My legs made a syntax error. They stayed. I waited for them to fix themselves. The girl with the knit hat and the metal badge bumped my knee with her bag and said, "Sorry," in a voice like she had borrowed it from a friend. I said, "No problem," in a voice I recognized. I got off. The afternoon had that dull cotton light that makes everyone's hair look like it's been there a while. The gulls were bold because more people meant more dropped things. A gull landed near my foot and looked at me with the yellow slitted eyes they have. It opened its beak and closed it, making the shape of chat with no sound. I wanted to tell it something, I didn't know what. That night, I went to the locksmith AS and asked him for a key to the middeck gate. I said it without jokes. He said, "I got keys for a lot of things, Cal, but if you want one for that, you better ask the water." I laughed because he wanted me to, and because my body needed the physical act of exhaling with a sound to remind it I knew what jokes were. "Put some tape over your thumb," he said, nodding at the bandage. "Those little cuts get infected if you keep sticking them in machines." He was right. The cut had gone pink along the edges. I didn't go to a doctor. The health clinic had a light above the door that buzzed so loud I walked past it twice and decided I'd rather lose a finger than sit under it. I started sitting in the back of the ferry where the view was more of what had just happened than of what was coming. You get a better sense of your story that way sometimes, in the wake. The fog made a shape there I had not noticed. a ripple with a clean edge, as if something had passed through and taken part of the substance with it. You could argue it was heat, the difference between air that had met a warm hull and air that hadn't. But if you looked at the ripple and then looked at the faces of the people sitting near it, they had an expression like they were reading a book in a language they'd learned late. When I woke up early to pee, which I did now like an old man, I stood at the bathroom window and could see down to the street where the locksmith sign swung. It made no noise because the night had taken the wind and put it somewhere else. I put my hand on the glass and felt warmth, my warmth probably. I told myself it was mine, that the world didn't warm the glass for me. Years of being alone train you to talk to yourself without moving your lips. The city put a guard at the pier for one day only. He had a uniform with a yellow stripe and a radio that chirped small, unfriendly sounds. He stood by the mid-deck gate with a stance like he had read a manual about how to talk to citizens and thought the stance was most of it. He left at noon. I overheard Murd on the phone saying, "We can't have a guard every day," in the tone of a man who knows the budget and knows the city better. The guard watched the line go and seemed sad in a way that would sound like a joke if you let yourself be careless with it. He wasn't sad for anyone in particular. He was sad for the idea that you stand at a gate and yet it is not yours. I dreamed of Elm one night. We were in the house we rented before, the one with the draft in the hallway and the door that swelled when it rained. She stood in the kitchen and made eggs. The smell filled the room with a sweetness that had nothing to do with eggs. She said, "You can go," and I said, "Where?" And the whole house tilted as if someone had lifted one side with a jack. I woke up in the tilt and had to put my hand on the wall to be sure it didn't keep going. I stood like that, hand on the paint, until my breath calmed enough to return to my chest, like a tenant arriving with groceries and apologies. You are thinking, you went mid-deck. I didn't, not yet. The delay will look like drama. It wasn't. It was the same thing that keeps people at a job past their contract and keeps people together past their last sentence. The habit of the bench, the sound of the horn, the way the validator beep arranged itself in your day. The day I went, the sun had tried a little and made the fog into sections. You could see a boat nose for a second. Then it was a grey card trick. I stood at the gangway and felt the texture of the metal under the rubber. All those little diamonds that are supposed to grip your work boot. I saw the gangway screws I'd replaced during the spring maintenance, the ones that sit proud because the threads refused to meet. I ran my thumb over a chip in the paint. These details felt like lovers you touched to recall their particularities in case you need to describe them later to yourself. I sat near mid-deck and I watched the people who rose. They rose the way yeast does in a bowl you had forgotten under a towel. Quiet, inevitable. I stood when my legs told me they had an errand. I stood without the drama of decision. The line in front of me had the man with the suit and the woman in the long sweater. They looked like two magnets hung on a nail. I tapped my maintenance card because it was in my hand, and because I honestly wanted to hear what tone it would make mid-deck. Beep. The sound had a little fullness to it I had not heard from the gangway. The display went up one, and the gangway count went down one. The mechanics of it soothed me, the way numbers meticulously recorded soothe people who have seen a lot of their lives go missing. We moved forward. The gate opened along its slow hinge. The fog had weight inside the mouth of it like a throat. The smell was clean and wrong. The wrongness of a new coat in a room that smells like old smoke. I put my hand out. It resisted my hand a tiny amount before letting me. It felt like wool over ice. Someone behind me shifted their weight and their coat brushed mine, and my body recognized a human, while my head concentrated on the fog like it was an exam. The horn sounded once, not in warning, but as if to mark a place in music. We went. You expect heat. One expects myth to give you heat or cold. There was neither. There was a pressure, like being underwater in a deep tub with your ears under and your mouth above. My breath sounded loud. I felt the fog on my lips like a person with a cold breath breathing into my mouth to tell me something. Everything had the damp of laundry left too long in a machine and then set to dry in the sun. A step forward happened with my knee and then my ankle, and then I was in a space that wasn't the deck. I was in a place that had the deniability of a hallway. I could see nothing. That's not quite true. I could see whiteness, which is not light and not a surface, but something between. I could hear the engine through whatever separated me from the deck. I could smell nothing but the clean wrong, and then under it, the smell of a bakery I'd once gone to as a kid when my father liked me that day and bought me a sticky bun. I lifted my hand and saw it as a shadow shaped like my hand. I put my hand down again because my body disliked seeing itself that way. Forward was all there was, so I went. My boots hit a surface that did not give way, but did not insist on its hardness. That's the closest I can get to how the walking felt. The idea of ground was maintained, but the act of it had been edited. There were sounds. Tiny ones, like paper being sorted 2 rooms over, like a zipper catching, like the sound a spoon makes in a thick sauce. I lifted my hand again. The shadow of it had a double edge. There were other shadows in front and to the sides. I do not know if they were people. I did not want to find out by doing something called calling out. I do not understand why I didn't. I could imagine turning my head and putting my mouth near the space where a shoulder might be and saying quietly, "Excuse me," or "Am I going the right way?" And that might have been a good idea, but nothing in my mouth wanted to agree to that work. My teeth felt like piano keys before a performance, a little dry, squeaky on the first touch. I moved my tongue across them and felt the small ridges time has put in their tops. I do not know how long I walked. I can tell you how many breaths I took if you let me make a number up. 300. More. I know that my body had to remind my mind to sustain forwardness. Each step brought the smell of bakery, and then something like a new car, and then a classroom after rain. I passed from one smell to the next, as if a person with an armful of histories had been stationed to let you sample them. If you believe we are all a collection of rooms we have lived in and left, then the fog was a tour guide. At some point, not a point really, but a smoothed corner, I heard a beep. Not the validators beep. A beep like something being measured had decided to report. Then another. Then a cascade, far ahead, like a grocery store on a holiday when the line is long, and they open a second register. I walked toward it because sound collects people. My breath did something it hadn't, a small catch. The floor put a new idea under my boots, an edge, not the truly dangerous kind, just the suggestion that you should not step as carelessly as before. Then it thinned. The fog thinned. It wasn't gone. It was like walking out of a warm room into one that has been heated by a weak sun. Shapes became more than shadows. People were there, I think. They were not silhouettes. They had the generic detail of a crowd in a mural when the painter had run out of specific faces. Many shapes of hair, many arrangements of shoulders. A man in a plaid shirt whose pattern did not quite resolve. A woman in a jacket with a fur hood that had fur and yet no hair in it. A child holding a hand that did not belong to my idea of a parent. Everyone moved forward like we all were late together. There was a light ahead, but not a light like a bulb. It was a feeling of more. The line S front arrived at it, and the beep sounded in one long tone that I felt in my chest the way you feel a train more than you hear it. The shapes slid through. Some slid up, some slid down, some slid sideways in the way a ferry can slip the rope and leave. I could not tell if anyone turned back. I had the sense that turning back would be like stepping into a room where someone else is asking to have what you brought. Not dangerous exactly, just double booked. I'm a man who likes a handrail. There was none. I put my hands in my pockets because I had to do something with them. They closed around my maintenance card. The plastic was cold. It's hard to explain how a piece of plastic can be the only confidence you have. I held it the way people hold prayer cards. I moved forward until the fog pressed into my face like a cloth. I opened my mouth to take another breath, and the fog went into me as if it had been poured from a pitcher. It did not choke. It did not burn. It sat there and became breath like a good house guest becomes furniture. I was through. On the other side, there was a platform. It had bolts set in it that told me it was a platform. There were lines painted on it, the kind of lines that tell you where to stand and also remind you that someone else has stood there to paint them. Overhead was a ceiling like a sky that had decided to pause. There were objects, not many, and none of them named. A pole, a bench, a ticket machine that had no slot and no instruction. A wall with the kind of wallness that says I could be around you, or you could be around me, depending on where you start from. There were people. They were the people from the ferry and also not. Their faces had the ordinary of every morning. Their hands went through motions their lives had taught them. One put a bag down and straightened it and picked it up again. One looked at a watch and then, without seeing it, let the arm with the watch fall. Another ran a finger around the inside of a coffee lid. The absence was noise. There were no voices. Mouths moved to drink and to breathe and to hold the lower lip in the teeth the way you do when the thought you are having is a furniture you can fit in a room. The mid-deck gate slid shut behind us with the carefulness of a parent leaving a sleeping baby. I stood and tried to think. Thinking felt like walking with a limp I had not had before. If there is a public space that has made itself to mimic all other public spaces and yet put nothing inside that could be claimed as a detail, it was this. The smell was the smell of a classroom on the first day and a hospital on the day you are well enough to go home and not the day before. I could taste the idea of discharge. I do not know if that is real. Ahead was an opening. There was the sense of light there again, the not light. People went toward it. I went because I am a person who goes where the line goes. If an alarm had sounded, I would have stopped, but there were only the beeps, and the beeps grew softer, as if the tone had tired of its job but would continue out of duty. We walked out into a space that might have been the inside of a building or the outside of a fog. Hings had edges again. There were signs I could not read. They had letters, but each letter had been made by a child who remembered letters and not language. A rut wrote one. Uklo wrote another. I felt a relief that I could not read the signs. If I had, they would have told me what to do. I prefer to be told. I also prefer, sometimes, to stall. A man stood by a rectangle. He wore a jacket. His face had the color of beige paint. He held a device like a validator, but without a screen. People went to him and held out their hands as if to have them stamped at a fair. He touched their wrists. Beep, they moved on. I watched a woman go past him without offering her wrist. He did not stop her. He licked his thumb as if to turn a page that had not asked to be turned. I looked down at my wrist. There is a blue vein you can see under my skin where my watch sits. I thought of the locksmith telling me to tape my thumb. I thought of Elm turning a page with a lick of her thumb, the gesture of a careful person who wants to be sure of the grip. I held my maintenance card up. The man looked at it like it was a coin from a country he had never visited. He touched my wrist with his device and it did not beep. He looked at me with the face of someone who is often mildly embarrassed on your behalf. He touched the device to my maintenance card. Beep. He said, "You're all set," in the tone of a pharmacy tech, and I thought of pills and their small, hard promise. We went out into a space that may have been a terminal. It had benches. It had a board that clicked in a rhythm that made me feel like I needed to get out of the way of someone's bag. The board read, "On time." Under that, "Crew, 0. Under that, "Gates, all." The click of it was the sound of the office light at a particular time of day. There are parts here I can tell you with accuracy because the world had returned to some of the rules that let a mind catalogue. There was a stand where a man sold cups that had nothing in them and surrendered nothing when held. He took no money. People received. There was a room with a glass wall where, if you had a certain angle, you might have seen water. The water moved backward. There was a smell like dust on a long-topped book. It made me want to sneeze. A child sneezed and put his hand to his face, and then looked at his hand as if to ask whether that was his sneeze or someone else's. His mother gave him a handkerchief from nowhere and said, "There you go." And he said nothing, and the world felt for a second like it had been restored. I began to look for the way back. This was not courage. It was a habit of my job to find the hatch. There is always a hatch. I looked for signs that read exit and got Ixai, and that made my chest itch. Why? I asked. In my job, why is a good word? It makes a flowchart. It hits a switch and a light goes on. He looked at the rope like it might answer for him. That rope holds nothing, he said. We don't want it to forget. I stood. I'm maintenance, I said, as if I were at a door where the person does not want to see your badge and you hold it anyway. He nodded. I can tell, he said, not unkindly. You could open us if you wanted. Is there an us? I asked. He looked at me, and the place beyond me, and the string of letters that could not decide whether they were a word. Maybe, he said. Don't pull, he said again, and this time there was fear in it. I did not pull. I liked the idea that something could be held by our pretending to hold it. I wondered. I stood. The mid-deck gate opened and closed, and no one minded the mechanics of it except me. A feeling rose and lowered in the crowd like a group sense of the weather. The notion that we were all going somewhere had, for a time, been enough. Now it grew tired. People began to sit in a way that is not rest, but preservation. I joined them. My boots squeaked against the knot floor. I put my hand on the bench and felt nothing. Usually wood tells you a tree story, stone tells you sun. This told me that it had been made, that was all. Time became a list a child might write on a board, morning, afternoon, evening, but without the lines you draw to separate them. I stayed long enough for hunger to go away. At some point new people came, at some point others did not remain. Did they go through a door? I cannot swear. The idea of counting failed me. Numbers are beautiful, but they don't hold anything if the thing wants to move. Somewhere behind everything the horn sounded, not hers, ours, the deck's. It was faint, like a memory you don't like to acknowledge aloud. People's heads turned a little, the way birds do when they hear a thing that matters. I need to go back, I said to the man with the beige face when I saw him again. Back where? He asked, polite. The pier, I said. Pier 6. He looked at me with the mild sadness again. No one goes back to a number. That's not true, I said. It is here, he said. But not everywhere, he added, like he wanted to be decent about it. I have a job, I said. He thought about that a long time. We all have jobs, he said. Some of them are not where we thought. I have a locker, I said, because proper nouns sometimes hold me. He nodded. I had a locker once, he said, like a man at a bar pretending to have just thought of it. It had a picture of my dog. Fish, I said. He blinked. No, Dante, he said. You had a fish? It was a dog, I said. He nodded again, as if obeying the rule that the second person gets to be right. If you walk to the rope and then past it, and then if you place your hand on the wall where the seam is, you will feel cold. Walk into that. Will it be there again? I asked. He shrugged. Something will. I went to the rope. I did not touch it. I walked past to the wall. The wall had a seam. Every made thing has one. I put my hand on it and felt the cold you feel when the magnet kisses the door of a refrigerator. I pushed. It yielded like stiff knees. The fog was there, on the other side, not like a curtain anymore, but like lungs. I went in. The return had different rules. There was a moment of lost, like you get in those old department stores where the escalator turns you away you didn't plan to go. Then the deck smell came back. Diesel, wool, coffee, rust, breath. The horn sounded. The gate parted its routines. The validator beeped. I stepped through onto the ferry, an object again among objects. The man with the suit looked at me and then passed me with no register of recognition. That was fine with me. The woman in the sweater did not sit where she had sat before, because it was later in the day and the light made the other bench less honest. I sat and held my maintenance card in my hand and put it back in my pocket and then took it out again. When we docked at the pier, I walked the gangway. Beep, said my card. The gangway count went up by 1. It surprised me that it did. I went to the office. Murd looked up and then down with the look of a man who has seen you and cannot stand to be the one who has seen you first. You're back, he said. I went mid-deck, I said. Don't tell me that, he said. Not angry, but something like it. You know they got a rule. Who's they? I asked. He looked at the light. It was humming again. He stood and adjusted it a little and it stopped. Eat something, he said. You look tired, I offered. Checked out, he said with a little laugh. I kept my card, I said, as if that were proof of something. He nodded and broke a pencil in half without meaning to, because the drawer stuck and he had jerked it too hard. You'll do the bulbs at 8, he said. They're writing me about 8. They're always writing me about 8. I did the bulbs. They felt slippery under the new towel. The glass had that faint powder on it bulbs have when they're new, as if they'd been dusted with sugar. I held each one and screwed it in and ignored the hum by replacing the ballast bodies. The ballast always looks like a good idea. I like that about it. The days after that had the shape of a mattress someone has slept in for a long time. You return to the same dips. I went mid-deck again. I went twice, and then not for a week. The man who touched my wrist asked me the second time, why, and I said, I thought I needed to check the rope, and he said, don't. But his voice liked mine a little better that day, so he wasn't afraid for me as much as for the gesture. Some days I only went to the gangway and watched others go. The count was a story I learned to read upside down. Glenn asked me once in the bathroom, you okay? And I said, I think so, and he said, you are making the kinds of faces I make when I do not know. And I said, how do you live with that? And he said, you go to work, and washed his hands for a very long time, then shook them dry instead of using the towel, because there were 2 towels left, and he didn't believe Murd would remember to order more. One morning, the sign at Pier 6 read, on time, under it crew, 0. Under that, counter, 0. That was new. There had always been numbers at the beginning, if only as a joke. That morning there were none. A woman stood by the sign and laughed. She laughed so quietly that if you weren't near her, you would think she'd cleared her throat. A man said, what? Like he wanted to be included. She said, we're already finished. He looked at the sign, and then at the ferry, and then at his hands. He put his thumbs together and made a little bridge with his fingers like kids do when they re-board, and then he stopped because he felt silly. The ferries ran. The fog came. The fog went. The city posted an advisory. Pier 6 to undergo scheduled maintenance. Service unaffected. I printed it and taped it to the glass with blue tape, and when the corner folded over and got dusty, I left it, because that is how I knew what day it was. Beep, went the validators. A child asked his mother, "Where do they go?" And the mother said, "Shh," out of habit, and then said more kindly, "On their way." A seagull walked the pier like he had a meeting, but it had been cancelled. One evening, after the last ferry had docked and the ramp rested its knee like an old man sitting down into a chair, I walked onto the deck alone. The mid-deck gate was shut. The validator had no light. The wheelhouse reflected the sky. I walked to the lectern and put my maintenance card on it and heard a beep that was very faint, a beep like a radio left on in a room you had recently vacated. The display did not change. The horn did not sound. The ropes lay the way rope does when work is over. The hatches closed themselves with the small sigh that metal makes. I stood there and felt the boat settling. It's like being in a bath when the water level goes down past your skin. The air touches more of you. I went home and put my boots by the door and lay down and slept without waking to pee. Dreams came and went like trains that do not cry their arrival. Elm did not appear again. The locksmith's sign swung in a wind that had returned to the street. I heard laughter in the hallway that didn't make me angry, which is a simple miracle. In the morning I came to work and Murd said, "We're closing 6 for a day." "Why?" I asked. "City says so," he said. "Maintenance." "Whose?" I asked. He shrugged. "Yours, I guess," he said. "Print the sign, will you?" I printed the sign. I taped it to the glass. The corner folded and gathered dust by noon. The day Pier 6 closed, the fog came without weight. It lay like breath on a mirror before a shave. Pier 6 had rope across it and a sign that said "closed" with a font that made it look even more not open. I stood by the rope. People went to other piers. 4 and 7 took the traffic. Their validators beeped with the single tone, not the double. The mid-deck gates on those ferries did not open. The crew count said 2, and the wheelhouse had men whose shoulders sloped from years of looking out for things that Don T looked back. I felt something like relief. I watched the boats come and go and made notes for myself about the bulbs at 7. The hum there was different. It was a key higher. Late in the day, a man in a jacket that could be called official if you wanted quiet words came and unhooked the rope across Pier 6. He did not look around to see if anyone watched him. He did not read his clipboard. He folded the rope in a way that told me he had folded rope before and set it on the pier with care. The sign still said, "Closed." He did not remove it. He walked to the gangway and pushed a button inside a panel that is supposed to be locked. The ramp lowered with a sound like a steady throat. The horn sounded. It sounded longer than usual and then stopped. The validator's light came on mid-deck. No one was there to see it, but me. He turned to me finally. "You can work," he said. "Work at what?" I asked. He looked at my hands. "Holding," he said. "Counting, screwing in bulbs." "The gate?" I asked. He smiled with half his mouth. "It holds itself," he said, "but it likes to be noticed." "What happens if no one notices?" I asked. He nodded as if I had passed a test I had not studied for. "It invents someone," he said. "Where does it go?" I asked, because my last defense is always a map. He looked over my shoulder at the city whose face you could draw in outline within 3 minutes. He looked at the water whose face you cannot draw, only suggest. "Away," he said with apology. That night, I stood by the mid-deck gate while it opened and then while it closed. I had my maintenance card in my pocket and my notebook in my other pocket and a pencil I'd sharpened with a knife. People came and went at other piers. Pier 6 had none because the sign said "closed" and most of the world obeys. The gate's seam held a smile if you looked at it like a person who has learned to find smiles anyway. I put my hand on the gate, not in a repairman's way, not in a man's claiming way, just a hand. It was warmer than the air around it. I let the warmth move into my palm. I took my hand away and wiped it on my jacket to hide the feeling. Weeks later, a memo came. It had no header, it had no names. It said, Pier 6 operations will continue as per schedule until further notice. It had no signature. Murd pinned it to the corkboard with a thumbtack whose plastic head cracked from age. The crack looked like a lightning bolt. He pressed the tack in with the edge of his hand and left a small crescent in his palm. He looked at the crescent and rubbed it. He said, "You want to transfer to 4?" like he was offering me an out. "No," I said. "Why not?" he asked. "I like the way the light looks," I said. He nodded like a man who has heard a better lie, but will accept yours for the purposes of the day. I kept going to the pier. I kept noting the beeps. The double tone returned. The fog sometimes lifted enough you could see beyond the nose, and when it did, the boat still went to blue squares on a map that showed only water. People filed aboard. The validator thanked exact change. The horn lied in the same ways it always had. Some mornings no one went mid-deck. Some mornings the line formed before the ferry even cleared the pier. Some afternoons the display stuck at 1 for minutes and minutes, as if the ferry were negotiating with the fog about a single person's kindness. Sometimes it went to 0, and the horn sounded at once, and the gate opened with something I might call eagerness, if a gate were allowed such words. I learned a trick for tasting the air and knowing whether the gate would open. It's not a trick, really. You breathe through your nose and the back of your tongue does the thinking for you. It tells you if the air you hold is the same as the air the gate holds. If the two are laced, the gate opens. If they are not, it does not. I told this to no one because it didn't sound like a thing a man should put in a report. It sounded like a thing an aunt would say over cooling pie. And I don't have an aunt. The weather-vane woman never came back, at least not where I could see. The man with the suit did for a while, and then didn't. The teenager with the knit hat tapped mid-deck on a Thursday, and I watched his metal badge catch the light, and then saw it no more. Glenn kept cleaning. He whistled once in a while. He put an extra roll of paper towels on the sink in the bathroom because we had run out. He covered it with a nylon bag so no one would get fussy about him not putting it in the proper container. He washed his hands a long time. He looked at me like he wanted to ask me something almost every day. He didn't. I wanted to tell him something almost every day. I didn't. Were there days when I hid in a supply closet and clutched my maintenance card like a schoolboy with a hall pass in the correct color? Yes. Were there mornings I lay in bed and thought, if I can just sleep to the second horn, then today will be different? Yes. Did I think about Elm when the fog breathed in my direction and the rope lay there like a sentence I couldn't finish? Yes. Did I think about buying a plane ticket to a city with no fog and a job with no rope? I looked at the price once and then closed the tab. Flights leave, I know that. Boats leave too, and they leave from where I can stand. If you want a story that ends with me going and staying, a choice with a moral, this doesn't give you that. The last day I'm telling you about was just last week. The fog was light, the gulls were loud. The validator S, light in the morning, came on half bright until I stood under it, and then it whitened up, like a person making themselves sit up straight in a photo. "On time," said the sign. "Crew, 0, it added, as if to reassure the part of me that loves numbers. The line was short. People had learned other ways to travel when the rumor had too much work for their nerves or their jobs could be done from tables at home. I watched a man take a lid off and put it on again, a small act that reminded me of all things that can be restored to the place that fits them. I did the bulbs at 7. I came back to 6. I stood on the deck at the mid-deck gate without getting on. I leaned on the rail that had been polished by coats and rings and impatience. The fog slid its back along the boat's side. The gate had that warmer-than-air feel. I put my hand on it and thought of all the people who had come and gone through it, and all the people who had stood where I stood and not known whether they would go. I thought for a minute, that it might help whoever came next if I wrote something on the metal, a better sign. A sign that said something honest like, "We don't know." I didn't have a marker. I held my maintenance card up and rubbed its edge on the metal as if that could inscribe a history. It didn't. The card made a small squeak that I liked. Someone behind me said, "Excuse me." I moved. He went through after the beep, and then another, and then two more. The display said 4, the gangway said 0, the horn sounded, the gate opened, the fog breathed, and the ferry answered. I counted down without writing. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. I rubbed the heel of my hand against my chest because I've learned a small, firm touch can convince your heart to continue as if you do not notice it. The ferry pulled away on its schedule, which existed whether or not we had our watches set to it. I replaced a bulb near the bench by the gangway. It needed doing. I held the bulb and felt the powder and the threads. I screwed it in. The light came on. The hum settled. I felt the warmth on my wrist. The tape on the sign had collected dust. The blue color of it had faded. I put 2 fingers on the corner and lifted it and smoothed it back down. It held. The line at 7 shifted, and the gulls decided it was in their interest to fly there instead. A siren sounded far away, the lazy kind. Glenn went by with a bag of trash that was heavier on one side and walked like a man balancing his own days. He nodded at me. I nodded back. We both did our jobs. It was almost noon. The ferry came in empty. It lowered its knee. It opened its mouth. I stood to the side and watched. Beep, it said. Beep. People boarded. The validator counted. The cup lids dimpled. The speaker said, mind the gap. The horn sounded. The wheelhouse held fog. The mid-deck validator lit. The line formed. The gate warmed under my hand. It opened. The rope slid on its deck cleat with the slow kindness a rope decides on after years of practice. The boat adjusted its stern to the moorings, a small dance meant for a crowd that no longer claps. The signboard clicked, and for half a breath, it could have been the light. It said Crew 1. Then it clicked again, 0. I did not move. The ferry did. The gate did. The fog did. My hand on the gate registered the heat of itself and the cool of the day. The validator spoke. The numbers rolled. A baby on a lap made the soft open mouth sound babies make when their bodies are telling them to get their needs met. The mother rocked without moving. A gull let go of a shell, and it clattered on the pier, and the gull looked down to see if it had become food. The city behind me made the low wooden sigh of its lights coming on, even though the sky still had the color it takes when it can decide. The horn spoke its syllable. The rope curled back with patient care. The next trip would begin, as every trip does, whether or not we had written down the names, and I stood where I stood with my maintenance card in my pocket. The cut on my thumb healed into a small white line that will outlast any rope, and the air in my nose that smelled clean and wrong in a way I had learned to count on. If this story lands with you, please like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who enjoys quiet, literary horror. Comments are open. Tell me your favorite image or line.